Imagine this. You're watching a basketball game. You're on the edge of your seat. The score is tied. It all comes down to the last second. The buzzer sounds. Your team loses. Now imagine that as you walk out of the stadium, you see the players high-fiving each other, laughing, celebrating what they thought was a victory. You would probably feel cheated, angry, betrayed. That feeling of betrayal is something we all know well, whether it's a friend who broke your trust or a business partner who double-crossed you. But did you know that this feeling actually has a name and a history? It's called corruption. Corruption, a short history. Corruption, a word that sparks anger, frustration, and even fear. But corruption is not a modern invention. It has been with humanity since the very first civilizations. Whenever there is power, there are those who try to bend it for personal gain. So today, let us uncover the history of corruption, how greed and betrayal shaped nations, destroyed empires, and left scars that still remain. Ancient roots of corruption. The earliest records of corruption date back thousands of years. In ancient Mesopotamia, officials were punished for taking bribes. The Code of Hammurabi itself, the world's first written legal system, warned against corrupt judges. In Egypt, scribes and tax collectors skimmed off grain from farmers. In Rome, governors of distant provinces often grew richer than the emperor himself, exploiting lands they were meant to serve. Corruption was so widespread that the Roman historian Tacitus once remarked, "The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws." The fall of empires. Throughout history, corruption was not just an annoyance, it was a force that brought down empires. In China, during the late Han Dynasty, corrupt eunuchs at the imperial court drained resources, sparking revolts. In the Byzantine Empire, bribes determined military positions, weakening defenses against enemies. In the Mughal Empire of India, lavish spending and corrupt officials drained the treasury, paving the way for colonial conquest. Corruption rotted states from within, long before invaders struck from outside. Medieval greed and betrayal. During the Middle Ages, corruption wore many faces. Kings often sold titles of nobility, while the church was accused of selling indulgences pardons for sins in exchange for gold. This practice became so scandalous that it inspired Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, sparking the Protestant Reformation. A movement that forever changed the religious and political landscape of Europe was born out of outrage against corruption. Colonial corruption. As European powers expanded overseas, corruption followed. Colonial officials often enriched themselves by exploiting native populations. In the British East India Company, many officers became incredibly wealthy through corruption and trade manipulation. The phrase nabob was coined to describe company officials who returned to Britain with fortunes made in India, often through questionable means. In the Americas, Spanish governors and conquistadors looted gold and silver while enslaving indigenous peoples, masking greed with a language of exploration and empire. Modern corruption. Old problem, new forms. By the 19th and 20th centuries, corruption had taken on new shapes. Political machines in the United States, like New York's Tammany Hall, controlled votes through bribery and intimidation. In Russia, corruption in the Tsar's court fueled anger that contributed to the 1917 revolution. And in many newly independent nations after World War II, corruption among political elites drained wealth meant for development. Even today, corruption costs the global economy trillions of dollars each year. From rigged elections to embezzled funds, the pattern remains. When leaders put personal gain above public service, society suffers. Why corruption survives? So why does corruption persist through history? Because wherever there is power, there is temptation. Leaders control resources, laws, and armies. Without accountability, many choose greed over duty. But history also shows that corruption never goes unchallenged. From reformers like Martin Luther to modern anti-corruption movements, people have always fought back. The story of Alexander the Great is legendary. A young, ambitious ruler who conquered most of the known world, founded cities, spread Greek culture, and died young, leaving behind a vast empire. But what many history books do and tell you is that Alexander's rise and reign were greased by bribery. His father, King Philip V of Macedon, secured his son's future through strategic bribery. When it was time for Alexander to wed, Philip paid a hefty sum to the king of Epirus to marry him to his daughter. This hefty sum was almost half of the entire annual revenue of Macedon. This set the tone for Alexander's reign. He continued to use money to secure alliances and get things done. Historians say he lavished gifts and grants on influential figures, turning potential rivals into allies. Even his generals were rewarded handsomely for their victories. For instance, Ptolemy I received the governorship of Egypt after Alexander's death. One could argue that this system of gift-giving was a clever way to keep everyone happy and maintain control, but it was undeniably a form of corruption. Alexander may have been a great conqueror, but his empire was built on a foundation of bribes and kickbacks. And speaking of Egypt, did you know that the country's national sport, handball, was invented by the ancient Egyptians as a form of bribery? Legend has it that the sport was created to entertain the pharaohs, while the common folk played a different game. They noticed that the pharaohs enjoyed watching them play, so they decided to make a version of the game more appealing to the royals. Over time, the two games diverged. The one favored by the masses was rough, competitive, and even violent. Meanwhile, the version played by the elite was refined and formalized, eventually becoming the modern sport of handball. But let's move on to ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy and Western civilization. Athens was once the preeminent city-state in Greece, but its golden age came at a cost. The Athenian Empire was built on the backs of slaves, and the wealth of its citizens was often the result of exploitation. Let's take, for example, Cleon, a prominent Athenian statesman who used his influence to amass a fortune. Cleon was known for his cunning and ruthless ambition. He used his political power to enrich himself and his family, often at the expense of Athens's allies. He was also notorious for his extravagance, throwing lavish parties and living in a mansion with over 1,000 rooms. While Cleon lived large, the average Athenian wasn't so lucky. The city-state's empire was constantly at war, and the burdens of war fell heavily on the poor. Many Athenians lived in poverty, and slavery was widespread. Cleon's story is a reminder that even in the birthplace of democracy, corruption and inequality could thrive. Now let's fast forward to ancient Rome, the largest and most powerful city in the ancient world. Rome's emperors were known for their extravagance, and some of them took their love of luxury to the extreme. Take, for example, Nero, the infamous emperor responsible for the Great Fire of Rome. Nero ruled from 54 to 68 AD and was known for his cruelty and insanity. He spent lavishly on his own pleasures, including hosting extravagant parties and building his massive Domus Aurea, a 300-room palace complex. Nero's excesses didn't end there. He was obsessed with the arts and wanted to be seen as a great performer. He hosted musical and theatrical performances, driving his chariot in the circus and even acting in plays himself. He appointed influential people in positions of power based on their connections rather than their qualifications, leading to corruption and inefficiency throughout the empire. It's clear that the problem of corruption is nothing new. It's been around for thousands of years, and it's affected societies all over the world. So how can we tackle this age-old problem? Well, one way is to learn from history. By understanding the causes and consequences of corruption, we can work to prevent it from happening in the first place. We need to promote transparency and accountability in government and business, and we need to educate ourselves and our children about the dangers of corruption. Most importantly, we need to remember that corruption is not just a problem for politicians and CEOs. It's a problem for all of us. We all have the capacity for greed and selfishness, and it's easy to justify bribery or kickbacks when we see others doing it. But we must resist that temptation. We must be willing to stand up against corruption and speak out when we see it happening. The fight against corruption is a long and difficult one, but it's worth fighting. When we live in a society where honesty and integrity are valued, we all benefit. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. Thank you for watching, and until next time.